Hello, everyone. Welcome to the latest episode of the Creative Confidence Podcast, where we talk to subject matter experts about creativity, leadership, innovation, and growth. I'm Colita Stafford. Quick reminder for those of you joining, we'd love to know where you're from. So please share your location and where you're joining us from today. We've already got quite the global group, people from London, UK, Barcelona, Portugal. Quite apropos, Bryan and Natalia, yes, because we're going to be talking about a pretty big global topic today, yes?
For sure.
So I'm very excited to welcome Bryan Walker and Natalia Vasquez to talk about the role of design in the climate era. So Bryan and Natalia are freshly back from Dubai, where they attended COP, which is the United Nations International Climate Conference. For those of you who may be unfamiliar, it's the world's biggest climate gathering, consisting of over 100,000 government delegates, NGOs, and industry activists who come together to discuss how each country plans to meet their commitments to keep the world temperature increases below 1.5 degrees. So quite the forum. So Natalia and Bryan will both share some highlights from that event. But more importantly, we're going to spend some time talking about diving deep into how design plays a role in helping us get to more sustainable climate solutions. We're going to talk about this idea of radical desirability. We're also going to talk about how design plays a role in futuring and how that can help drive action. Welcome, Bryan and Natalia. Thrilled
It's
to
great
have
to
you
be
guys.
here.
How are you feeling today?
Great. Good to be here. Yeah.
Good. So I'm gonna give you each a moment to talk in just a moment. First, I'm gonna gush about your bios, but before I do that, I want to engage our audience in a question, and I am going to invite all of you to put your answers in the chat. A warm-up question: what challenges come to mind when you think about the climate era? So it might be related to your work, your community, but what comes to mind when you think about the climate era? And I'm going to ask Bryan and Natalia to answer that too. So go ahead and put your answers in the chat. And let me share more about these two amazing designers and leaders. So Natalia is a senior lead. She has over a decade of climate experience across the sectors, from the US Department of Energy to the Nature Conservancy. At IDEO, she focuses on guiding organizations to imagine and test possible futures for action. This is super exciting. We're going to get to that, but you're going to want to know more about this. And she helps guide transformation amidst climate change. Her work has been recognized in publications like Forbes and Fast Company, and she's worked with a diverse array of clients, from Conservation International to Walmart to Meta and many more. Welcome, Natalia. Thrilled to have you here.
Thanks. Good.
Yeah. Bryan Walker is a longtime IDEO veteran and partner. He's also been on our podcast a couple times, I think. He leads IDEO's climate era domain, which means he's done a lot of work helping organizations design and evolve their business and culture in pursuit of innovation, growth, resilience, and impact in the climate era. Bryan's work has been featured in multiple publications such as the Harvard Business Review, Fast Company, and the New York Times. Bryan, you also have quite the array of clients you've worked with, from Nike, Apple, the Aspen Institute, and many more. So let's dive into some content and let's talk about what challenges come to mind when people think about the climate era. So I do want to hear from both of you, but let's just take a look at what are some of the ones we're seeing from our audience around the globe. What comes to mind for people? Oh, I love this one. What can a person do? That's a good one. What else? Putting nature on the board, giving it a seat at the decision table. Natalia, I know you agree with that. I know you think about that one. Bryan, Natalia, any of the ones you want to pull out?
I love that.
I
I
think
am also seeing sort of culture and human relationship to climate challenges. So the feeling of hopelessness, questions about whether we'll get there. And I think that's so interesting at a level of thinking about change across culture.
Yeah, it is a good one. I like this one too. Someone's Elliot talking about how do we map, understand, and leverage the intersections and the interrelatedness of all these things? It's a great one.
Yeah.
Well,
I think
Bryan,
there's some nice ones too about how do we actually keep this issue front and center, knowing that there's all sorts of other crises happening around us too. And there's quite a bit around disadvantaged communities and the inequities that are present within our world, but also how climate change could be a potential source of addressing some of those or worsening some of those.
Thanks for bringing that one up. Yep. So why don't we, Natalia, I'll start with you. What is something that comes up to mind for you when you think about, the climate era?
Yeah. I mean, I think the climate era is a time that's really defined by humanity's first, like, long-term global systems problem. It's every sector, it's every country. And so, for example, greenhouse gas emissions, the things that are driving climate change coming from any one country, really impact all of them. Or eliminating, large parts of the Amazon rainforest influences rain and weather patterns as far away as North America. So it's the super complicated, interconnected challenge. And working on all of that requires this incredible alignment, which is not easy. And then layered on top of that, climate challenges are impacted by what everyone on Earth, the humans that we designed for, currently extract and consume. And changing that requires a lot of culture shift around sort of how and what we value. So those together, to me, form the crux of the challenge.
How about you, Bryan? What comes to mind for you as you think about challenges for the climate era?
I mean, I agree with so much of what Natalia is saying, and if I was to say some of the challenges that we're going to be facing, it's really about global collaboration at a scale that we've never seen before, as well as long-term thinking, which isn't something that we as people have always been fantastic about in terms of acting now in consideration for what's to come, and maybe what's to come even outside of our lifetime. I mean, the reality right now with climate change, you're feeling it within our lifetimes, but still that notion of long-term consideration for actions now is quite a challenge for us generally.
Thank you both for sharing that. So we'll talk more about that. Let's set the stage. Let's go back to the COP28 conference for a moment. And I think this is just valuable because it helps set the stage for how all of our global nations are thinking about it's kind of the state of the narrative with regards to the climate era. So Natalia, I'm going to start with you. For those you've attended it since 2014, so you've been through many of these years. What's one thing that stood out for you this year? And for those who may be new or unfamiliar, why should we care about what happens at COP28?
Yeah. So COP28 is, and COP in general, it's the United Nations convening around climate change. COP stands for Conference of the Parties. Parties being the delegates from the countries around the world that come together and negotiate and reflect on how they want to reduce their emissions and how they want to approach navigating climate change. We have this insane, giant humanity level problem, and it's the forum where the decisions are made at the highest level. And it's not just about country commitments and sort of how we reduce emissions, but all of those choices and conversations then trickle down into the ways and the context that organizations operate in and the way that people like all of us live our lives. So it's a really important moment in convening because of that sort of pace setting and context setting that it creates.
So what was something that stood out for you this year in particular?
Yeah, I mean, this year was interesting. We had a few years ago in Paris this commitment to 1.5 degrees of warming, and everyone sort of set that as our global goal. And then 2 years ago, we had the first sort of really significant wave of private sector involvement in Glasgow, which is important because it's going to take all sectors to help make change on this issue. And so this year, following out of those moments, was really thinking about for the commitments that we've made, particularly around moving from fossil fuels to renewable energy, and then making available the money that it takes to adapt to climate change if you're a vulnerable country, or to redo your infrastructure for decarbonized electrification. How do we fund those activities? So there was a lot of emphasis this year on sort of getting things done, action, and making progress against commitments.
Okay, I'm going to come to Bryan for you in just a second, one of your takeaways. But Natalia, is there any takeaway that you are personally sitting with that's really top of mind for you?
I think one thing that I wonder about is that the conversation every year at COP feels a little bit like more noise in a time that maybe needs more focus and speed. Um, Balanced with, I was really excited and heartened to see that there was a commitment to move away from fossil fuels. This is the first time at COP that that's been sort of codified into text. And so we're kind of in this transition moment where the world agrees that that change is needed, which is significant. And so now folks are thinking about, okay, how do we start to phase out potentially entirely fossil fuels? And there was an announcement around a sort of global initiative and commitment to trying to work on fusion, which is more of a far future renewable energy, but that commitment is important because it signals the kind of leaps that we need to be making. So that one gives me a lot of hope.
That's great. How about you, Bryan? What's one takeaway that stood out for you this year?
Well, certainly one of the high level impressions was just the scale diversity. And I think a little bit what Natalia was referencing too is the spectacle of it all. It's pretty impressive, but also it's a lot.
Yeah.
In terms of the takeaways, maybe I had two real key takeaways. One was that we are clearly past that phase of commitment and it's all about action now. And action both in terms of what we are starting and accelerating, equally what are we phasing out of and stopping. So I thought that was really clearly felt within the conversations and the layers and layers of conversations. It seems like we're in the space of action. The other takeaway I had, or impression I really had, was how the private sector has arrived in this conversation, which historically has felt a little bit more public and social sector based for all the obvious reasons. But there is a very strong private sector presence there, which I know has people have mixed opinions about. But if we really are going to pull off what we need to pull off, we are going to need to be engaging the private sector as part of that solution. So I personally was encouraged by actually seeing more presence of the private sector in the conversation, knowing that there's still challenges there too.
Okay. This is a great start. So both of you touch on a big theme that I hear you both saying. It's less, the focus is on speed and less on kind of just talk and commitments, but to action. So let's talk about that. And in particular, one of the areas that you guys are both very skilled in is the role of design. So can you share more about the role that design can play in these challenges? And in particular, how it helps us take action, move away from just commitments to actions. So why don't we start with you, Bryan?
Okay, sure. So maybe the first place to start is, well, how do we look at the challenge today? And I would make the case that the climate challenge now is a human challenge of adoption. And so what I mean by that is, yes, we're at a place where we are exceeding the boundaries of our planet, making it inhabitable for millions of species, including ourselves. And there's all sorts of reasons for that: global populations, our economies, our lifestyles, all of that. However, the really interesting thing is when scientists were really first sounding all the alarm bells, a lot of the question, or the central question, really was, can we address climate change? And now it's flipped into a question of, will we address climate change?
Meaning we do have the solutions, we can?
Exactly, because I feel like that is the big shift that we're seeing now. It's happened for a bit, but basically we have all of the solutions we need today in order to address our Paris Accord commitments, whether those be technology-based, nature-based, or behavioral change-based solutions. Now, you can see there's a lot of different organizations that have really done the work of chronicling those solutions and beginning to measure how scalable they are and what's the potential for impact there. Probably the most noteworthy is the work from Project Drawdown. Maybe we can drop a link or something like that.
We'll add that link,
around that. And within that, you can see that we have what we need to pull this off. But
so tie it back to adoption. You started by saying adoption.
Exactly.
Though. Okay.
So I think that's where you get to is, all right, so we have a climate challenge, but it's really a human challenge of adoption. We have the solutions today, but will we adopt them fast enough and far enough to actually pull this off?
So what will design do for that? How does design help in that?
So, as a designer, and I suspect many people on this are designers, there's a few things that I think we're particularly good at.
Hmm.
Uh, Creating, imagining new futures and beginning to build and create new experiences that are highly desirable.
Highly.
And
We're
so,
going to use the word radically desirable, Brian.
yes,
Yes.
radically
Yes.
desirable.
Radically desirable.
Yeah.
Okay.
So basically, if we've got the solutions, we
Hmm.
need them to be adopted. How do we make those solutions radically desirable?
Perfect. We're going to talk more about that. I appreciate your framing too. It's moved from not can we do it, but will we do it? And a key piece of it is the adoption and how we scale solutions to be so desirable that the climate friendly solution is the most desirable one. Yeah. So
Indeed.
and you mentioned it can play a role in kind of imagining futures too. So I'm going to come back to you, Natalia. Can you share more about what is the role of design in helping take action and in particular this idea of futures, imagining the future?
I think there's something really interesting that featuring can do around alignment and inspiration. And so
Mm,
something that I've heard again and again across these events and the work that we've done is that people really need to envision where they want to go. It's very hard if you don't have a destination.
yep.
And there are a lot of individual sort of visions or objectives. So you can imagine like a specific technology has a pitch deck and a horizon, or a policy is proposed that has an outcome that it is hoping for in 10 to 30 years. But there's such a craving for weaving. So like, how does the culture and the technology and the policy come together? What does that world look like that we all will exist in, however it forms up in, in 2030 or 2050? And that lack of sort of collective alignment, I think, adds to that noise that I was talking about. And the other piece of that is that it's hard for people to, and even myself to get
Oh,
minds around and to really feel compelled by like warming or 1.5 degree change. And so, how do we make the possibility of the future come to life, both in all of its wonderful potential and the challenges and trade offs of the technologies or the changes that we're going to have to make? Um, and then, I guess the last thing is, futuring can do some pretty heavy lifting around alignment. So, I mentioned at
mhm.
the beginning, it's a really complex problem. You need cooperation across all kinds of industries and countries, and um, getting to that kind of alignment can be really challenging. And so with futuring, you can start to look at what might it look like in the future if we all saw the change that we want. What is it that we are all aiming for, and then how do we start to work backwards to get that alignment?
Love it.
And so I think design can step in there and help to create the container and the process to create the research that design is so good at doing at, and then the fictions and sort of the scenarios that bring to life what's possible.
I love it. So how about we make this a little bit more tangible? So both of you are sharing two big themes where design plays a role. So one, adoption at the consumer level, radically desirable products. And then Natalia, you're talking a lot about alignment. Like adoption and alignment are the two big things I hear you guys saying over and over. And design plays a pretty big role in how we can make that happen. So let's make it tangible. I'm gonna go back to you, Bryan, and let's
Okay.
talk about this idea of what does it look like in practice to make products or experiences more desirable? What does that mean? Do you have some examples and how do you do that? What does that look like in practice?
Yeah. Okay. I'll give you one maybe hypothetical example,
Okay.
just that I think everybody can relate to. So, what I'd say in practice about making climate solutions highly desirable, it's about looking at the solution and figuring out what is really its unique affordances.
Hmm.
And then how can you amplify those affordances into highly desirable experiences? So an example would be, I think this is one that people can relate to, is a stove. You got
Okay.
gas stoves, you got electric stoves, right?
Mhm.
With gas stoves, a lot of people love them. You've got your burner, you've got fire, you've got all familiarity. But then when it comes to electric stoves, well, what might be something that's very unique about that technology that you might be able to leverage?
With the flat surface.
Exactly. So
Okay.
like
Okay.
So basically, you don't have a burner
Mhm,
anymore, so you have a
mhm.
flat surface. And what that could potentially afford you is you could begin to turn the cooking surface equally into a prep surface. And so now that
Ah,
it's a prep surface and you have a hood, you can put a camera, you can put a
mhm.
projector on there. You could begin to imagine using that technology to help you appropriately prep your food, no longer having to measure portions, but actually knowing as you cut whether or not you have the right portions. Then imagine once you start cooking, you could have your cookbook projected directly onto the surface next to you. You could even have the play-by-play instructions. You could begin to think about how you take this unique affordance that a gas stove could not replicate and actually take that and turn that into now a really desirable
A
experience of
desirable.
making you
Yeah,
a better chef.
love it.
So that's just one that hopefully gets people understanding this concept of what are those unique affordances, and then how do we leverage those into truly desirable experiences that only can be done because
With
of taking
that.
advantage of this climate solution.
So just to take a step back to, you keep saying the word affordances. Can you clarify what that means in case I think I understand, but just what does that mean?
Yeah. So it would be attributes that afford new experiences or new kind
Okay.
of capabilities.
And so like all of these solutions for climate era challenges, we could look at it through that lens. We could look at these technologies, these solutions with that lens of what is unique to that particular solution, and then work towards making that the desirable thing. Is that what you're saying?
Yep. Yes.
Okay. All right. Do you have any other examples?
Yeah, plenty of examples. So maybe I'll talk about an example of work that we've done,
Okay.
because you can always go a little bit deeper in there. So a project that we had the privilege of being a part of is, well, doing a lot of work with Ford Motor Company,
Mhm.
um, really helping them with their electrification strategy. And an iconic project within that relationship was the design of the electric version of the F-150 truck. It's now in the
Okay.
market. It's called the F-150 Lightning. It's been selling very well, but it's also been described, and we love this, as not the electric version of the F-150, but a better F-150 because it's electric.
And just for a global audience who might not be familiar, this is a pickup truck. It's the most
Picture
pop.
picture picture the classic pickup truck,
Okay.
and a very popular one. I think you're going to go there. One of the I think it's the best selling vehicle in North America for the last few decades.
Okay.
So with it, one of the things we looked at with the brief specifically was not to create the EV version, but to
Okay.
create the better version.
Ah,
And the affordance you have now is because it's electric, you have an energy source.
mm,
And so
mm.
what do you do with that? And we basically just tried to create features that were only possible on a truck because it was electric, not internal
Wow.
combustion. So you had, I'll give you a few examples. The tailgate, you can convert the tailgate into a workbench where you can plug in your power tools and go to work. If your home goes down with a power outage, you can plug it in as electricity backup. And then another one that's
Wow.
actually getting quite a lot of attention is less about is it's about recognizing what's not there. So without the internal combustion engine in the front hood, you now can turn that into massive storage. But can you leverage that even more to make a desirable thing? So
Mm.
a lot of what was explored was, could you even turn this into a cooler, not just a storage unit? So basically,
Wow.
what are all of these new experiences that you only can bring to life because it's leveraging a fundamental climate solution?
Love it.
That's another, hopefully that's another example that helps.
That's great. No, I so appreciate this. And because you are making it, you're delivering on the the intent of moving away from we have the solutions to moving towards decisions using design that helps with their adoption and actually promotes action. And so
Yep.
like in the case of the Ford F-150, that has been doing really well in the market. So that's
Yeah.
another example too. Like we
Well,
want it to filter down to actual actions
yeah.
and
Well,
behavior
I'll give
shifts.
yeah, and I'll give you another because I think this is a really important point here. And I'll give you it's another car example, but I think it makes the point is one of the things that's really important, because I think to this point, a lot of the effort has often been about making products more sustainable. And then therefore the value proposition is this is the responsible choice. And that has limitations in terms of the demand and the scale that you can reach because it's a values purchase, as opposed to this is just simply a better product because it's sustainable. And so the example I was going to give is just look at the sales of the Toyota Prius versus the Tesla Model Y. And one really, I mean, it's not a knock on Toyota. They were a real pioneer in this space, but one very much was positioned as an economical, responsible choice. And the other was simply a more desirable choice. So a better driving experience that so happened to be powered by electricity. And you just look, you see which one took off, which one changed the industry. And I think that's a really powerful, important thing, is to see how we can make these sustainable solutions, not the responsible choice, but the desirable choice.
Desirable.
That so happens to also be responsible.
Love it. So thank you, Brian. Natalia, I know you have comments on this topic too, but I'm actually going to move us on to the other category where design plays a significant role. And you mentioned it, it's this idea of futuring and how it can bring alignment. Let's just start with the word futuring. What is that? What does that mean? And then tell us how does that play a role in alignment?
Yeah, I think of futuring as design. It's a discipline and a sort of a flavor of design, but where your inputs and your horizon is not today's behaviors and context, but sort of the emergent observations that you can make, and then the long-term design horizon that you're looking at, the long-term output that you want to get to. And so if I'm thinking about alignment, within climate, some of the big challenges are, for example, that you've got companies that need to report on their emissions. And to do that well, they have to understand the emissions of all of their suppliers and all of their buyers, and then what the customer does at the end of life of the product, or how they engage with the service. And that's like a lot of information transparency systems to create. Or there might be a big scale opportunity, like there was a group in the EU that needed an electric fleet. And so multiple companies then pulled together resources to get that fleet up and running. And so that's the kind of, when I'm talking about alignment, that's the kind of opportunity that is possible. And so then futuring comes in and is thinking, okay, can we look at trends together? What's happening? What are the forces that we're seeing around our industry, around the world? Where might those lead us as we think about climate change and the impact on the way that we live and consume? And then how do we start to create fictional scenarios or ideas of what could be, so that we can have a reaction, and then choose whether we want, if that's like a preferable future that we want to be moving towards, or away from. And sometimes that looks like a prototype in the way that we would do design. It's just a prototype set into the future in a longer horizon.
So what I think I hear you saying is I can imagine as all these different stakeholders come together to think about their future needs, I'm guessing the conversation often goes towards logistics, or how are we going to do this? What's needed? What I hear you saying is looking at using story and fiction as a mechanism to have richer conversations. Can you give us an example? Can you ground this in an example?
Yeah. I think just to build on what you were saying there, it's really part of what's so powerful about design in this is that it can make the future tangible.
Oh,
So
I see.
it goes
Okay.
beyond text, it goes beyond a statement, and it's sort of saying, like, hold this thing or look at this visualization, and you can really start to picture what's to come. One example that I'm really moved by right now is we've been doing work with a global meat and dairy company. And so that's a challenging industry. There are methane emissions, there are transportation emissions, packaging. And so we brought in future visioning work as part of some longer term sort of strategy development that we were doing. So we looked at trends that would impact their industry. You can imagine kind of like what people want to eat, or how regulatory pressures might be coming in around the agriculture sector. So we brought all these trends, emerging technology, to board meetings, and had them look at what the implications might be of those trends for their business and for their work. And we brought that to life, not just sort of through our own narrative and kind of text, but also creating these really, scrappy fictional products that could exist in the future, like one of their products, but we've added a carbon emission sticker to it, or
Okay.
an app where you could quickly scan any site and it sort of shows what the emissions would be on that location. And actually, out of that work, we helped to sort of shift the conversation in that executive team and in the board, to really center climate as one of the issues that they want to make a part of their 10-year strategy, which could have really significant impacts in the longer term.
Yeah. So I love these examples, and I'm gonna gush about you. I've watched you recently shared a 5-minute video. I think it was with the Long Now Foundation, that also brings this example, that brings this technique to life about how you create a future story in order to then have a conversation about its implications. And I remember I want to share the link. It's available on YouTube. You say in that it's not about trying to get the right future. It's not trying to like say we know exactly what it is, but it's a prompt in a conversation. And would you say, so when you do it with climate, what is the output? Like what happens then in groups when they realize this? What do you see happen?
I mean, I think there's just a deeper understanding of the nuance. So you
Okay.
have maybe your like headline idea of how climate change might impact you, and even for people listening, like your personal life. But when you start to get into a fictional future, you're looking at all the mundane details. Brian was mentioning the stove. You're thinking about the packaging and the labeling, and then that has so many potential implications for design choices or strategy choices. So I think a lot of the reactions I hear are like, "Oh my goodness, I hadn't thought about this particular part," and it just helps to open up conversation. And then, as you're saying, we're often looking to not be too dystopic or too utopic, and so that's just really good fodder for emotional reactions and for talking about well, what's preferred, what's ideal, and then what's realistic for us.
Yeah.
Great. Bryan,
Do you
please, yeah.
mind if I jump in? Because I had the pleasure of
Please.
working with Natalia on this project around the meat and dairy. And I thought one of the things that really struck me out of the futuring work and sort of the outcomes that from it was the realization that, right, we introduced a lot of different future forces. And there's a lot of conversations about which ones.
What do you mean future forces? What do you mean?
So about climate. There's going to be basically these forces that will create the context, will influence the context in which they would be operating in. Natalia was 10 years out, right? Is what we were really pegging on. And we had isolated a subset of those that we thought were the most significant for their realities.
Okay.
In that conversation, one of the things that really came out of that was so striking and was universally felt across all of them was you looked at some of these forces and they could
what's a non-climate force, like AI or
certainly there's technologies, particularly how they would influence their manufacturing operations at scale, right? Yeah. Emerging technologies would be one. There's also really interesting stuff in terms of local regionalization as opposed to globalization, what that means in terms of trade, et cetera, things like this. The thing that came up out of this was climate's different than many of these others because you can't opt out of that one. It is literally the air we breathe around
impacts
us.
Yeah.
And they're like, so we could, it's not like we can decide like, no, we're not in on this one. It's like, that's a thing that we're going to have to deal with. And then showing those tangible things that Natalia mentioned, that all of a sudden helped. I found took it from an abstract concept into a tangible, into tangibly in their world, which then allowed for creativity to actually begin to expand of saying, well, if this was true, then what would that mean? What would you do next? And they could begin to actually see, all right, we can't opt out of climate. And maybe it's not actually, if we lean into it, there actually could be opportunity in there as opposed to just constraint.
Maybe they could look at the unique affordances of their solutions and design exciting, radically desirable options, right?
Exactly.
So we are going to move. This is wonderful. We are going to move on to questions. Natalia, I want one closing thought from you on the futuring. and then we're going to go to questions. Do you have any tips there are passionate people listening today, capable people who are looking for more ways that they can bring design into their work around climate needs? Do you have any tips for how somebody might get started in adopting this futuring techniques in their work? And then we're going to go to questions.
Yeah.
And Bryan, I'm going to give you something to think on real quick. Sorry. People want an example of a service example of affordances. So I'm going to let you think on that one.
Right.
Natalia, back to you.
Sure. Two quick ones. I think, like in the design work that we do, we always want to be curious and learning. And so a lot of futuring work is just signal scanning, which means constantly looking around for emergent behaviors, news events, emerging technologies, and just being curious with yourself about, okay, if these continued into the future and started to sort of blend and merge, what might happen, but really just like observing that content and then keeping an eye out. And then an activity that I could maybe suggest, you could even do it with yourself now, or as you go through your work, is reflecting on a time horizon. So like 10 years, what might the world look like 10 years from now? You can imagine, who knows, but abundant renewable energy, or a big shift to really value nature. Someone put in the chat, technologies that maybe help us communicate with nature. So you think, okay, 10 years out, what do I think might happen? And then which of those changes would be a headwind versus a tailwind for us? So something that would be, really great for my work or for the mission that I'm on in the world, versus more of something that would be a challenge and that I need to start thinking about how to get ahead of. So even just like as a 5-minute exercise, that can be really powerful to open up opportunities.
Love it. Thank you so much. So just to recap where we're at, we're talking with Natalia Vasquez and Bryan Walker on the role of design in the climate era. In particular, we've been talking about how design plays a role in not just making the sustainable solutions, but the desirable ones. And we've been talking with Natalia around this idea of futuring and the role of imagination as a way to convene alignment. So let's go to some of your questions. And Bryan, I'm going to start with you. We have
The service one?
Yep, we have someone asking about, can you do an example of a non-product, a services example that brings out unique affordances that are radically desirable?
All right. Yeah, I'm going for the ones that I think everybody can kind of relate to. So let's talk about fashion. The fashion
Oh yeah, let's
industry
talk about fashion.
is certainly has some challenges, particularly on the fast fashion side of things.
Yep.
So one known climate solution is reuse and repair of garments. And so, all right, if we're talking about that, then what's the unique affordance? Well, you no longer have fresh and new clothes because you're talking about reuse or repair. But what you do have is you have experience and history embedded as part of a garment. So how do you take that and actually begin to leverage that and turn that into a highly desirable part of the shopping experience, part of the story of the garment that you might buy and what might attract you to that garment? So I want to grab that one because hopefully you can begin to see, all right, what might be some of the services that you wrap around that?
Wrap around it.
But also how sometimes these affordances, they've been cast as negatives to the experience, but maybe they just you need to look at them differently and actually build a different experience around them to take what some might say is used and then actually garments that have history. And really bring that into a desirable shopping experience.
I love that example. Thank you. So we're going to go in a different direction. This is one that I know both of you actually care deeply about and have done work in. So this is around the idea of the impact on vulnerable communities. So I'm just going to read it because it's beautifully written. So as a social worker and academician with research interests in the design-oriented practice, how might the social sector partner with private sector or other stakeholders to address the climate change's impacts on our most vulnerable communities? So I think part of it is like how might we better collaborate, and also maybe just what is the awareness of what is happening with the most vulnerable communities, and what are some of the ways that you are seeing organizations come together to address them? I'll let you guys decide who goes first.
I'm happy to speak a little bit to that. We've been doing work with Conservation International over several years, thinking about how to bring design into their conservation work, the human angle. And I think time and time again, there is this opportunity that is coming up around working at the intersection of communities that are either hold the most knowledge or are most directly impacted by the climate effects, and then how you could call it the private sector, but sort of economic activity could be a supporting mechanism for those groups to have more agency in how they're tackling climate change or to better resource them. And so one example is we worked with their Africa team in Kenya and South Africa on rangelands, which are these basically the grasslands where all of the big megafauna live. They're huge carbon sequesters, meaning that they're taking greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere, putting them into the soil, which is really important for climate change. And there's a lot that the people that live there that sort of herd cattle on those lands can do to better grow plants that sequester more carbon. But they need, obviously, they have, like any of us, hopes, dreams, livelihoods, people to take care of. And so there have been opportunities that we've explored and really seen CI lead around helping to create marketplaces for the cattle that they're moving, helping to better uplift them and connect them as teachers of that knowledge, and how to bring in more sort of private sector buyers to the goods and the products that they're creating on those lands. We've done similar work with them around thinking about islands, which are communities that face tremendous sea level and sort of weather event challenges, and thinking about how to use the combination of protecting land, but also doing production. You can imagine like offshore marine protected areas, which islands have all around their shorelines. Lots of fishing opportunity, lots of conservation opportunity, and so thinking about how to bring those together as well.
Wonderful. Bryan, anything you want to add? And if not, I've got a different question for you.
No, nothing to add here. Let's jump to the next.
Okay. And we just had another one added. We're going to come to at the end. And Natalia, you just touched on it too. It's a bit of how do you have hope in this? So, Bryan, this is a question around the mandate. So going back to COP28, there are a lot of agreements.
Yep.
What can be said about if and how they can actually be implemented if there are no requirements? And Bryan, I've often heard you talk about this idea of movements over mandates, and there are ways forward beyond just kind of mandated. So I'm curious what are you seeing with regards to movements happening as a way forward when we're still navigating the space of how to require action?
Yep. I mean, I think the more we can begin to create the movement around this where you're increasing demand for it, the easier it is to push it. And so I think if we're ever going to reach the speed and scale that we need in terms of this transition that we're going through in the climate era, you're going to need to push and pull that change. And what I mean by the push, and this is where most of the conversation centers, is the push is about policy and investment. The pull is about demand. And however, you see that it is a lot easier to push things when there is demand behind them. And so really often it's this back and forth between push and pull. You need both of them to reach the scale we want. But I think the more we can create, and this is where I think design and creativity play a radical role, the more and more we can make increase the demand around some of these very real, very now solutions, it will make it easier and easier for those to be pushed, whether through policy changes or further and further capital investment in the scaling of them.
That's wonderful. Thank you. So unfortunately, we are out of time. This has been amazing. I do have one final question. I'll wrap us up and then I'll let you guys take us home with your final answer. I'm actually going to pull it directly from Jennifer. I know there's a lot of bad news coming out related to climate change. As practitioners in this space, how do you maintain hope and optimism? So I'm going to let you sit on that for a minute and just what is your hope for the future? And I'll start to wrap us up. So again, thank you, everyone. Today, we've been hearing from IDEO's very own Natalia Vasquez and Bryan Walker about the crucial role that design can play in helping us achieve our climate goals by building more desirable, sustainable, radically desirable products and services, and using futuring as a way to align on visions and take action towards collective goals. If you'd like to hear more about these conversations, I invite you to check out our Creative Confidence series for more episodes. Bryan, you've been on before talking about movements over mandates. And if you're excited to dive in more about the concepts you've been hearing, we have a new course coming out at IDEO in spring, in March of 2024. So keep your eyes out for that. It's called Creative Thinking for Complex Problem Solving. With that, I'm going to go back to our question of hope. And I'm going to start with you, Bryan, and then Natalia, you can wrap us up.
Okay, the thing that gives me hope is actually humanity. I do think that we are an insanely creative species, and the ability to creatively problem solve is infinite within us. And we also are a group that tends to wait until the very last second to address a problem. And we are now at that point where I think it's a weird way to think about it, but the urgency and now the severity of the problem, I think is going to be the catalyst to unlock our true creativity.
Thank you. Okay. Natalia, your last
Yeah,
thoughts
no, that
on
really
hope for the
resonates.
future.
Yeah, I agree with Bryan. I think we're 8 billion people on this planet and have created this conundrum for ourselves, but we're also moving on it, and that gives me a lot of hope. And I'm inspired by and continually curious to see sort of how we might evolve ourselves and our paradigms so significantly that maybe in 100 years we don't even recognize ourselves because we have an entirely new relationship to nature. We've become true stewards. Our sort of relationship to consumption has changed to one another. So a bit abstract, but yeah, I get a lot of energy and possibility out of that.
Wonderful. Thank you both so much. And again, thank you everyone for joining us today. And as we close out this year, I hope we all look forward to some ways that we can think about how we can apply some of these things you've shared today in design, the affordances to think about how we might think differently about the things we create, and the ways we might consume them. So with that, thank you, everyone. Bye.